as the Covenant searched Earth for what would eventually become the portal at Voy. They would find other artifacts left by the Forerunners. The multiple incidents in this city's history must have led the Covenant to suspect something of use was in Roswell. And with their invasion of Earth, they took the opportunity to invade the city. At the time, the Covenant forces were already conducting an expedition in Arizona, so it was easy for them to send a small force to investigate Roswell. With other Spartans already fighting to defend Earth, Brian was deployed by Oni to Roswell. He was to stop the Covenant forces from destroying the city and retrieve whatever artifact they believed to be there. By the time Brian arrived, the Covenant were already deep in their attack of the northern section of the city. They had definitely found something. The city wasn't even able to conduct an evacuation by the time the Covenant arrived. People were scrambling to get out of their homes and away from danger, but ultimately, there were going to be casualties. The Covenant had brought a dozen phantoms filled with soldiers and mining equipment to excavate right off the main street in the northern section of the city. Covenant soldiers were tearing through the surrounding buildings, clearing them out and terrorizing everyone in their path. Brian wasn't typically one to use stealth, but with the enemies spread throughout the buildings and the fortifications they built around their dig site, he didn't have any other options. Going in guns blazing wasn't going to end well. Not after the last time. Brian was trying to be more cautious of his actions. He also started to prefer doing missions on his own. As Brian snuck through each building, he would encounter more and more enemies closer to the site, which meant he wasn't going to stay hidden for longer. Not with his stature and build. He decided to move to the top of a 15-story building that sat about 3 blocks from the excavation site. As he got to the roof, he encountered a jackal sniper, as they had taken over all the surrounding roofs in the area. He grabbed the jackal by the neck and squeezed so hard the jackal's neck collapsed in on itself, suffocating the jackal. He took the beam rifle the jackal was equipped with and started to locate each of the other jackal snipers were in the 3-block radius, and he marked each one on his HUD and started to pick them off one by one, ensuring the next one didn't see the previous one die. Brian's situation went from manageable to shitty, as he was spotted by a passing phantom. The whole area was now on high alert, and Brian could hear the building beginning to be swarmed by Covenant soldiers. He dropped the beam rifle and made his way down the stairwell. He heard voices echoing from the floors below him and stopped at the 11th floor. As he ran through the office space, the phantom appeared in the window, and Brian gunned it, jumping right out of the window and into the phantom. Since he was compromised, he figured he might as well go as loud as possible in hopes he could cause pure chaos. 3 elites were firing at him as he jumped into the phantom. Brian landed on the open side door of the phantom, and right away, the phantom tilted from the sudden shift of weight to that side. One elite lost his footing. Brian used the opportunity to grab the elite and throw him out of the phantom. The other 2 moved to take Brian in hand-to-hand combat. To say they were unsuccessful was an understatement. Brian still didn't have full control of his prosthetic arm, so when he threw a punch at the elite in front of him, he ended up punching right through the elite instead. His prosthetic got stuck halfway in, right at the elbow. He lifted the elite off the ground and used its body as a shield to bridge the gap between him and the third one. Once he was within range, Brian grabbed the elite by the neck. He then swept the elite's foot, putting both the second and third elite on the floor of the Phantom. Brian put his right foot on the elite stuck to his arm and pulled his arm from its lifeless body. With one elite now pinned by the other's body, Brian used the dead elite's energy sword to impale them both as they lay on top of each other. He moved to the cockpit, and with only one elite piloting, he killed it with ease. Brian moved the Phantom the 3 blocks to the excavation site. It took him a moment to figure out where the gun controls were, but once he did, he began raining down fire on every Covenant soldier in the excavation. It was difficult to maneuver the Phantom with all the buildings around, so it was inevitable that Brian would be shot down. The buildings in the area were filled with Covenant that didn't help either. Brian took out another Phantom by the time he went down, and Brian passed out for a second or two, but awoke in the cockpit of the downed Phantom. Brian stood tall, making his way out of the Phantom, and he saw he was being surrounded, and something strange came over him. He felt a rage he'd never felt before. And with the snap of a finger, Brian was ripping through the Covenant soldiers around him. Brian became so fast, he could barely keep up with himself. And he was taking out Covenant in just hand-to-hand combat. Brian ran the rest of the way towards the excavation site. On the way, he shook off what had just happened, and by the time he got there, the Covenant had fully uncovered a small ship, something that could probably only hold 2 people at most. Not human, and certainly not Covenant. Brian saw the ship rising from the ground as he was running in its direction. 2 brutes were directly next to the ship, with jackals and grunts guarding a few feet away. Just as Brian went to fire his battle rifle, running down the street, he saw something off to his right, and suddenly he was flying through the air. He went flying into the 2nd story of a small building. He landed on top of a desk, laying flat on his back. He heard crying off to his right, and as he looked, there was a man and his son hiding behind another desk.
These cities must be too close to the site. Can't get out of here in time. The boy and his father, they've been trapped. And by pure luck, or some fucking grace, they haven't been spotted by the Covenant.
As Brian stood up, he signaled to the father and son with his hand to stay quiet and follow him. Brian peeked out of the hole in the wall and saw a brute with a gravity hammer approaching the building. The brute stayed in front of the building and began hitting the building's supports with its hammer. The right side broke first, and the building shifted. Brian grabbed the father and son and told them to hold on. At 8 feet tall in his armor and 362 pounds of pure muscle at the time, Brian could easily carry both the father and son, but he wouldn't be able to shoot. The left side of the support broke, and the building began to fall forward into the street. Brian jumped out of the hole his body made and ran clear opposite side of the street to get out of the way of the building falling. Brian is instantly met with plasma fire and began to run down a side street to get out of the line of fire. Multiple Covenant soldiers followed behind, and Brian sent out a call to the Pelican that dropped him off.
Oscar 252, this is Sierra 505. I need an extract immediately. I have civilians that are taking heavy fire.
Copy all, Spartan. What about the artifact? Have you retrieved it? The pilot said.
Negative. The Covenant already had the artifact in their possession. Hurry! I repeat, I'm taking heavy fire!
As Brian continued to run, the comms were quiet for what felt like eons. Then the pilot finally came back on the comms, telling him where he was going to land, and sent Brian the LZ location to his hut.
Stop that! Coming in hot!
As Brian ran through the streets of Roswell, his shielding kept ticking down, never getting a moment to recharge. Brian emerged from a small alley and came to a large clearing with a city park about 50 feet away from him. The mob of Covenant behind him had easily grown to 30-ish soldiers. Brian saw the Pelican landing on the far side of the park and began sprinting in its direction. The park was mostly wide open. Some trees occupied the park, but nothing of sufficient cover. Though it spanned about 1,504 feet in length, the run felt like an eternity. Brian pushed himself to his limit, getting to that far side of the park as fast as he could. Brian, still holding on to the child, went flying into the air, landing just about 10 feet away from the Pelican. Marines came out of the Pelican to grab the child and give covering fire. Brian was shaken up, and as he was getting his bearings, more and more Covenant fire began to fly past him. He got up, turned around while grabbing a Spartan laser, and with a rageful scream, fired into the mob of enemies. Brian must have killed at least 5 of them with the initial shot, and injured others around it. The mob began to spread out to avoid more fire and take what little cover was available. Brian heard screaming from behind him and looked towards the Pelican to see the child screaming out for his father. Brian looked towards where the child was pointing. The father had slipped from Brian's grip and flown off to the right when Brian was hit with a fuel rod shot. He wasn't moving, and was far closer to the mob than Brian was to him. As Brian looked towards the father, he got a glimpse of a bigger object just past the father. He looked at it and saw a brute at the back of the formation with a gravity hammer. The one that sent Brian flying in the building earlier. He's walking towards Brian with a grin on his face. A sadistic one. Just like him. Just like Gargantum. That brute was coming to finish the job he started, but Brian was determined to rescue that father. Though Brian had felt fear come over him looking at that brute. His emotions ultimately landed on rage. Rage for his comrades. Rage for all that he lost. Brian and the brute locked eyes and went full sprint at each other, bridging an 80-meter gap within seconds. Brian figured out in the first hit that this brute was no Gargantum. Though it put up a decent fight, Brian didn't use anything but his fists to bring this brute to its knees. Now armed with the knowledge of what this prosthetic could do, Brian's final punch had so much force behind it, it made the brute's heart stop. As the brute fell limp, the rest of the mob stopped in awe of what had happened, before focusing fire on Brian. Brian grabbed the father and saw he'd taken a plasma burn to his right abdomen. So long as Brian made it back to the Pelican, the father could get treatment. Making the now 90-meter dash back to the Pelican in no time. The Covenant stopped firing as they had no more reason to pursue Brian if he was retreating. They had the artifact, and Brian had failed his mission. Again. After failing to stop the Covenant, Brian was just happy he could save someone, and felt a little spark of hope on the ride back. Brian couldn't wait to just visit Brenner with what little hope he was holding on to. Brian arrived at Brenner's room, and sadly he was still there, still asleep. The nurse told him that nothing had changed since the last time he visited, but Brian noticed the nurses must have adjusted him and taken his dog tags off, as they were now sitting on the table next to Brenner. Brian picked them up and sat by Brenner's side. He looked at the dog tags for a moment and began telling Brenner what had happened during the mission, how he saved some lives, but ultimately failed his mission. Once Brian was towards the end of his story, he realized he hadn't eaten breakfast, and it was already past time for lunch. As his stomach grumbled, Brian told Brenner he would be right back. Brian went to the station's cafeteria, still in his armor, no less, and quickly grabbed a few items of food. Brian was only gone for maybe 10 minutes before he returned. He was close to approaching the room when he saw several people in Brenner's room. First, he saw an older woman crying over Brenner, an older man behind her, and a young girl next to him. Then Brian looked to the other side of the bed and saw Rear Admiral Santiago. As the Rear Admiral moved from the right side of the bed to the left towards the family, he revealed the heart monitor he was standing in front of. 0. Flatlined. Brian's last bit of luck and hope were gone in an instant. This was the moment Brian checked out completely, and the Horsemen fully took over. He put down the tray of food and left the station with Brenner's dog tags still in his possession. Oni succeeded in their goal of breaking Brian, although it didn't quite work out how they planned. Now that the Horseman of War was in charge, Oni couldn't properly control him. He would go on multiple unsanctioned missions long after the Human Covenant War was over, one which destroyed his original prosthetic arm. Oni did outfit him with a new and improved one, and attempted to place him back under their control, but nothing was working in their favor. By late 2553, the Spartan they once knew as Brian G505 was officially classified as the Horseman of War for just how many battlefields he left destroyed by himself. Oni was mostly just pointing him in a direction, and he would return when he wanted to, and was always ready to be pointed in the next direction. Here's a fun example. Oni would send him on something as simple as a recon mission no combat needed, the horseman would return with the head of the highest-ranking enemy he found out there. Rival Covenant factions began warning each other of a devil that was wiping out entire factions on his own. Early 2554 came around, and Oni pointed the horseman in another direction, only for him to not return as he normally did. As they went to check his suit tracker, they found he was on a completely different planet than where he was directed to. They sent operatives to both where he was sent on mission and where he was found. Nothing was left of the place he was originally sent, no surprise at that point. But the operatives that were sent to find him went missing. Never reported in. Their bodies were never found. The horseman had broken his final set of chains.